On the morning of June 18th, 1905, off the Gulf Coast of Florida, a man dressed for another world stepped over the side of a small boat and sank beneath the water. He wore a suit of canvas and rubber, boots weighted with metal, and a great bronze helmet shaped like a bell screwed down over his head. A hose ran from that helmet up to a pump on the deck, where other men worked to send him his air. A rope ran beside it, his lifeline, in the plainest meaning those words have ever had. And as the bubbles trailed up behind him, that man did something no American sponger had ever done. He walked on the bottom of the Gulf, upright, like a farmer walking his field, and began to harvest it. The boat above him carried a Greek name, painted fresh over an old one. They had christened her Elpis. It means hope. This is the story of the men who came with her, of two brothers who left a dying island with nothing but an ancient craft in their hands and used it to build something America could not build for itself. We are going to call them Nicholas and Stavros. The names are our own. But the 500 who came in 1905 were real, and so was the ancient craft they carried and the price it asked. To understand what stepped off that boat, you have to travel back across the ocean to a small rocky island in the Greek Dodecanese called Kalymnos. It was a hard place. Stone hills, thin soil, barely a fifth of it fit to farm. And so for centuries, its people lived from the one harvest their home offered in abundance, the sea. Sponge diving has been called the oldest profession on Kalymnos. Every spring, its fleets, by one account some 300 ships, each carrying 6 to 15 divers, sailed out on voyages of half a year, working the sponge beds as far away as the coasts of Egypt and Libya. And every autumn, the island stood at the harbor to count who came home. For most of that history, the craft was nothing but body and nerve. A diver went down naked, gripping a flat stone of some 15 kilograms, the Scandalopetra, which carried him swiftly to the bottom, 30 meters down, while a mate above watched through a glass-bottom tool. For the 3, 4, 5 minutes his lungs would give him, he cut sponges by hand and gathered them into a net. Then, a tug on the rope, the oldest signal in the trade, and the men above hauled him back to the sun. Fathers taught it to sons. It made the island famous, and it made the island proud. Then, in the 1860s, the machine came. They called it the skafandro, the hard hat diving suit. Canvas and rubber sealed the body. Weighted boots held a man to the bottom. The bronze helmet fed him air down a hose from a pump worked on the deck. Now a diver could stay below far longer than any breath could carry him, walking the beds, filling basket after basket. The harvest multiplied, the wealth multiplied, and so did something else. Because the suit had arrived decades before science understood what the deep does to a body that rises from it too fast. The divers made dive after dive with no notion of decompression, and the nitrogen in their blood turned to bubbles, and it struck them with agony, with paralysis, with death. They called it the bends. By some estimates, in the first 50 years of the suit, it killed 10,000 divers across the Mediterranean. Kalymnos folded that grief into its very culture. To this day, the island dances the Mihanikos, the machine dance, named for the suit divers, danced in the halting, broken steps of a man crippled by the deep. A people who turned their maimed and their dead into a dance understood exactly what their trade cost, and they went down anyway. Nicholas and Stavros were born into all of it. Their father had been a stone diver of the old school. The brothers came up in the new one, and they came up as a pair. Nicholas in the suit, Stavros as his tender. The man on deck who worked the pump, minded the hose, and read the lifeline. Understand what that means. Every signal Nicholas sent from the bottom traveled up a rope into his brother's hands. Too fast on the haul, and the deep would cripple him. A fouled hose, a missed tug, a moment's inattention, and the sea would keep him. The craft was a two-man trust, and these two had practiced it since boyhood. Stavros liked to say he could feel his brother's mood through 30 meters of rope. He was right. And then the sea began to fail them. Around 1900, blights swept through the Mediterranean sponge beds and destroyed them. The voyages came home light, then lighter. An island that lived by one trade watched that trade begin to starve, not for skill and not for courage, but for healthy water. And an ocean away, there was water. The Gulf Coast of Florida held some of the only sponge grounds in the world fit for commerce, thick with wool sponge of superb quality. But America could not truly reach it. Since the 1840s, American sponging, at Key West in the Bahamas, meant a man in a little boat with a glass-bottom bucket and a pole, 20 to 30 feet long, with a hook on the end, prying sponges off the shallow bottom. The deep beds, where the real wealth lay, sat untouched. In 1890, a Philadelphia banker named John K. Cheney had launched the first sponge boat out of a small Gulf town called Tarpon Springs and built a warehouse, but the trade stayed shallow because the country simply did not possess the craft. One man knew both halves of the problem. John Kokoris, a young Greek from Leonidion, had come to Tarpon Springs in 1896 as a sponge buyer and gone to work with Cheney, his brothers in time, working alongside him. Kokoris knew what lay beneath the reach of the American hooks, and he knew that on the islands of the Dodecanese lived the only men on Earth trained to walk down and take it. In 1905, he went home to Greece and returned with divers, diving engines, air pumps, lifelines, and the rubber suits with their bell-shaped bronze helmets. A boat was made ready and renamed Elpis, Hope. And on that June morning, the ancient craft of Kalymnos touched the floor of the Gulf of Mexico for the first time. It was less a harvest than a revelation. Every 10 minutes, the baskets came up filled with wool sponge. By evening, the boat was loaded. The first voyage returned worth a small fortune. The news crossed the Atlantic like lightning, and to an island whose beds were dying, it sounded like deliverance. Before the year ended, more than 500 Greek spongers had arrived in the little Florida town. Dodecanese men above all, Kalymnians like Nicholas and Stavros, with others from Aegina and Hydra. They did not come as scattered laborers. They came as a whole world. Boat builders and coffee houses, groceries and music, their language and their church. Within a few years, a sponge exchange stood at the docks, where the harvest was stored and auctioned. The brothers dove and tended, saved and rose, divers first, then owners of a boat of their own. Nicholas came to know the beds like a farmer knows his fields, where the wool sponge grew and how to cut so it would grow again. And the town around them turned, dock by dock, into something no one had ever seen before, a piece of Greece grafted living onto the coast of Florida. They began to call it the sponge capital of the world, and it was no boast. At its height, the fleet counted as many as 100 boats and 1,000 divers, and by the 1930s, the sponges were worth millions of dollars a year. The price came too, as it always had. The Gulf was gentler than the deep Mediterranean runs, but the trade was the trade. There were men who came up crippled, and men who did not come up. And at the weddings and feasts of Tarpon Springs, the Mihanikos was danced by people who understood every step of it. In 1943, the community completed its great church, St. Nicholas, named for the protector of seafarers, the spiritual heart of a town that by the 1950s held some 3,000 Greeks and a school teaching their children in 2 tongues. And when disease finally struck the Gulf beds too, in 1939, and the industry slid into its long decline, the trade never entirely died. And the town it built remains a living piece of Greece on the Gulf to this day. Here is what the brothers understood that we forget. They did not come to America asking for a place in its economy. They came carrying something America's economy could not do without and could not do itself. A craft 1,000 years deep, paid for in generations of their island's dead. Their skill was their passage, their fortune, and their belonging, all at once. The blight had chased their trade out of its home waters. They carried it across an ocean to the waters that could save it. And in saving their own trade, they built America's. 2 rescues in 1 crossing on a boat named Hope. We do not know their real names. There were 500 of them, and then thousands, and the history books remember almost none. So this is for them, the brothers who came with nothing and gave a country the harvest of the deep. If their story moved you, then they are not forgotten anymore. Stay with us, and we will keep bringing the forgotten back into the light.